Superpower versus survivor. The real battle in a long US Iran war. The question, who will blink first in a prolonged war between the United States and Iran, cannot be answered by looking at military power alone. In fact, most serious analyses suggest that this conflict will not primarily be decided on the battlefield, but on endurance, political resilience, economic sustainability, and narrative control over time. So instead of asking who is stronger, the more relevant question is which side is less able to sustain the costs, political, economic, military, and psychological, of a prolonged war. When framed this way, the answer becomes more nuanced. In this video, the focus areas will be the nature of this war, the US constraint, which is power without patience, the Iranian constraint, which is weakness with endurance, key variable, which is time, the blinking dynamic, and lastly, final conclusion. First, the nature of this war, not decisive but attritional. The current US Iran conflict appears to have evolved into what strategists call an attritional war, where the US relies on high intensity, high cost precision strikes. Iran relies on distributed, asymmetric, endurance based resistance. This asymmetry is crucial. Recent reporting suggests that the US has conducted over 11,000 strikes in just 30 days. Yet Iran continues launching missiles and drones at scale. The conflict is expanding regionally. Lebanon, Gulf, maritime routes. This tells us something fundamental. The US can hit harder, but Iran can absorb longer. And in prolonged wars, absorption often matters more than firepower. Second, the US constraint, power without patience. Let's begin with the United States. First, military capability versus sustainability. No serious analyst doubts that the US military is vastly superior in air power, intelligence, precision, strike capability, naval dominance. But the issue is not capability, it is sustainability. There are already signs of strain. Reports indicate depletion of high end missile stockpiles, continuous high tempo operation, increased logistical and financial costs. A ground invasion, often necessary for decisive victory, is widely seen as unlikely. This creates a paradox. The US can escalate quickly but struggles to sustain that escalation indefinitely without major trade offs. Second, economic and domestic pressure. The US is uniquely vulnerable in one domain, that is domestic politics. Consider the pressures, rising oil prices due to disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, stock market volatility and economic uncertainty, public fatigue with foreign wars, political polarization, leadership hesitation. For example, dealing action in Hormuz is linked to economic sensitivity and public reaction. This matters enormously. Unlike Iran, the US leadership must constantly ask, can he sustain public support for this war? History suggests the answer is often no, especially in prolonged, unclear conflicts. Third, strategic ambiguity and objectives. Another major weakness what the US has, there is no clear end game. Options include regime change, which is extremely costly, deterrence restoration, that is negligible, negotiated settlement. But none of these are clearly defined publicly, and this ambiguity weakens endurance. Third focus area, the Iranian constraint, weakness with endurance. Now consider Iran. At first glance, Iran appears far weaker, inferior conventional military, sanctioned economy, limited air force, vulnerable infrastructure, but that is only half the picture. War is survival. For Iran, this war is existential. Iranian strategic thinking frames the conflict as a war of survival, not a war of choice. This has profound implications. Leadership cannot easily back down. Population is conditioned for resistance. Sacrifice thresholds are much higher. Compare this now to the US. For the US, this is a war of choice. For Iran, it is a war of survival. History shows that actors fighting for survival often endure far more punishment. Asymmetric strategy. Iran is not trying to win conventionally. Instead, it is trying to raise the cost of war, expand the battlefield regionally and economically. Examples: missile and drone attacks, proxy warfare, Lebanon, Iraq, Houthis, etc. Disruption of global energy flows. The closure or disruption of Hormuz alone impacts 20% of global oil trade, creates global economic pressure. This is strategic brilliance in an asymmetric context. Iran cannot defeat the US, but it can make the war unbearable. Fourth, the key variable, which is time. Everything in this conflict revolves around time. Short war, it is advantageous for United States. Long war, it is advantageous for Iran. Why? Because the US loses over time due to domestic political fatigue, economic costs, global pressure, resource depletion. Iran loses over time due to economic collapse, infrastructure damage, internal unrest, leadership pressure. So the real question becomes, which system breaks first under prolonged stress? Now, the last key area, the blinking dynamic. Blinking first does not mean surrender, it means seeking negotiations, scaling back objectives, declaring partial victory, avoiding further escalation. Let's analyze both sides. Scenario A: the US blinks first. This would look like declaring mission success, even if incomplete, avoiding ground invasion, accepting limited Iranian concessions, pivoting to diplomacy. Why this is plausible? Number one, domestic pressure because of rising costs, war fatigue, political opposition, resistance showing no signs of weakening. Second, economic constraints owing to oil shocks, global market instability, strategic recalibration by avoiding another long Middle East war. Historical precedents are Vietnam, Iraq, eventual withdrawal, Afghanistan, withdrawal. In all these cases, the US did not lose militarily, but chose to disengage politically. Scenario B: Iran blinks first. This would look like accepting a negotiated settlement, scaling back nuclear or regional ambitions, reducing attacks. Why this is plausible? One, economic collapse risk, sanctions plus war damage, limited reserves, internal unrest, military degradation due to infrastructure damage from sustained strikes. Now we come to the key question: who is more likely to blink first? Short answer: in a prolonged war, the United States is more likely to blink first. Why the US is more likely to blink first? One, lower tolerance for prolonged pain. Americans are sensitive to casualties, economic disruption, public opinion. Second, war is optional for US, not existential. The US can choose to disengage. Iran cannot because it is for their survival. Third, global repercussions. The US must consider in its own interest. What? Alliances, global economy, multiple theaters. Fourth, political cycles. Elections and leadership changes affect continuity. Now we come to why Iran might still blank. Iran could blink first if economic collapse accelerates, internal unrest becomes uncontrollable. However, the likelihood of this possibility is low because they are fighting a war of survival. And the nation is firmly behind their leadership. Now we come to the final strategic judgment. If forced to choose, short war in US favor. In long war, Iran's strategy becomes more effective. In political endurance, Iran is significantly stronger. In economic endurance, US is strongly placed. In domestic stability, US is more fragile. Final conclusion. The United States is not prepared for prolonged war, politically and economically. Iran, despite being weaker, is better adapted to hardships, more willing to absorb losses, strategically focused on endurance. So, in a prolonged war of attrition, the United States is more likely to blink first, not because it cannot continue, but because it will decide the cost may turn out to be humiliation in the end, hence, not worth it. Bottom line, this is not a war of strength versus weakness, it is a war of patience versus pressure, endurance versus sustainability, choice versus survival. And in such wars, the side that needs to win less often walks away first. In this case, the United States of America will be the one to walk away first. Thank you very much for supporting this independent source of information and analysis. Please subscribe if you have not done so.